let's begin a discussion of stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Let's ease into this by talking about the nature of the problem, specifically by defining some key terms. Stereotyping, prejudice, discrimination, it's really some very powerful stuff. Pretty frustrating too. Look at this picture. In 1957, Elizabeth Eckford was blocked from entering Central High School by the Arkansas National Guard. So she's just a kid, really, and she just wants to go to school. And you can see that society in general wasn't on board with that. And when I look at this picture, I'm always so stunned by the anger that I see in this person's face. I look at this woman right here and I see that she is right on her tail, and I don't know what her intentions are. There are guard members in the background and they're armed. That's some scary stuff. Well, of course, we don't typically see that level of overt racism anymore. Makes us kind of think, have things changed? Have they changed a lot? Are racism and sexism really no longer problems in America? I mean, let's think about it. Let's think about some things that have happened. We recently had President Obama serve 2 terms. Our first black president. That certainly shows that things have changed. This is a picture of President Obama with German Chancellor Angela Merkel. She's female, obviously, and she served 3 terms as Germany's chancellor. So 2 of the most powerful countries in the world are run by a black man and a woman. So certainly things have changed to some degree. I mean, think about Bernie Sanders in the most recent presidential campaign. He had a lot of support. He still has a lot of support. He's Jewish. And we see also in advertising with major companies like CoverGirl, they're now going to be featuring a Muslim woman. This woman is a well-known beauty blogger in one of their advertising campaigns, and that's the first time in their history. So clearly things are changing. And if we look at things superficially, we might think that our country is essentially post-racism or post-discrimination. But we'd be wrong to think that. Things have changed, but our ugly past keeps repeating itself, but nowadays in more modern ways. So people still are discriminated against. Sometimes the specific people are different. Particularly since 9/11, Muslims have a hard time in our society. They're certainly not welcomed with open arms in general. They're often looked at very suspiciously. Think about gays. A lot has changed for homosexuals in our society, but a lot stays the same. Think about how they're portrayed oftentimes on TV. They're often overly feminine if they're men, overly masculine if they're women. And oftentimes, portrayed as drag queens, something like that. It's just very stereotypical. Overweight people are often the butt of jokes. You could turn on almost any late night TV show and you'll hear some type of fat joke. So my point here is that sometimes the objects, the targets of our discrimination have changed. Disabled people. How many times do you hear other people calling others retards? That's hardly a nice thing in our society. And also the way that people are discriminated against, it's sometimes much more subtle nowadays, and it's harder to prove. Certain people are simply eliminated from consideration for jobs or maybe even housing. Our society also sometimes arrests people at rates higher for one group compared to another group. And of course, the Black Lives Matters movement is often a lot about that, about how a particular group of people is treated by law enforcement. Sentencing issues, too, are systematically different depending on people's race. And of course, there are just simply new ways nowadays to express racism, sexism, or other forms of discrimination now that we have the internet. Online, people are relatively anonymous, and it's really a fertile ground for spreading hate. So things have changed, but a lot of things have stayed the same as well. So really, the bottom line is it's critically important for us to understand the complexity of this issue and the causes of stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination so that we can help change our world. Let's define some key terms. People often use terms like stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination interchangeably. And although they're all related concepts, they're not the same thing. So let's make sure we can parse them out and really understand specifically what we're dealing with here. Prejudice. Prejudice, we're talking about a feeling. That's essentially an attitude, and it's almost always negative. So negative feelings about some group and its members. What are stereotypes? Well, prejudicial attitudes are based on people's stereotypic beliefs, and those beliefs link a group of people with certain traits and characteristics. Let me give you some examples. So, for example, people might think that women in general are emotionally unstable. That would be a stereotypic belief, linking women, a group of people, with some type of trait or characteristic. Maybe something like men are shallow, or politicians are liars and untrustworthy. Again, we're linking a group of people, an entire group, with some specific type of trait. Irish people are alcoholics. Jewish people are cheap. We could do this all day long. We're all exposed to these stereotypic beliefs just via information that floats around in our society. So we're usually all aware of the stereotypic information. It's not always negative, though. So, for example, here would be a stereotype that's more on the positive side. Asian people are good in math. But you have to understand that's still not really a good thing because it's still an overgeneralization. We're still trying to put people into some type of pigeonhole. And of course, our goal really in life, I believe, is to treat people individually as they are, as they truly are, not simply because of the color of their skin or their ethnic background. So we want to treat everybody individually based on who they are. Stereotypes are exactly the opposite of that. We are categorizing people based on their ethnicity, based on their religion, based on the color of their skin. Discrimination, let's talk about that. Prejudicial attitudes can often lead to negative behaviors, and those behaviors are directed against people simply because of their group membership. Let me give you a couple examples of that. Discrimination can be violent. Now, we don't see that quite as often as we have in our country's history, but we could be talking about lynchings. That would be a really extreme example of discrimination. Sometimes it's much more subtle, so it can be avoidance. So let's say a Caucasian person might discriminate against an African American person by simply refusing to date people of another race. So do you see how avoidance in that situation is a form of discrimination? Maybe something like exclusion from jobs, housing, from just entry into certain clubs. I mean, there are golf courses that still exist in our society that will not admit or do not want to admit African Americans. That's a pretty terrible thing that still exists in our society. That would be a form of discrimination. Keep this in mind too. Discrimination is not always so overtly negative. So, for example, special treatment could be a form of discrimination. So let's say I'm overly protective of some women because I feel that they can't defend themselves. Do you see how I'm not giving them quite the credit that they probably deserve? I might be opening doors, or let me carry that for you. That's probably too heavy. I'm sure that's a strong woman. She can do what she needs to do. And if she needed help, she would ask me for help. So if I'm being overly helpful, that's not necessarily treating her with respect. So that would be some form, in some respects, of discrimination, but it's hardly like a lynching. So you see, we have quite a continuum when we talk about the behaviors that can fall under discrimination. Now, in psychology, we've often talked about the ABCs of behavior and thought. So when we talk about A, we're talking about that affective component. So when we're dealing with prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination, prejudice is a negative feeling, so that's an affective component. Discrimination, we're talking about behaviors. And stereotypes, we're talking about how people think, so that's a cognitive component. So that might also help you understand the bigger picture here. As we talk about discrimination, racism and sexism are essentially a form of discrimination and prejudice. So here we're talking about prejudice and discrimination that's based on a person's race and gender. And another way to think about a definition of racism and sexism would have to do with institutional or cultural practices that promote the domination of one race or gender over another. So in other words, sometimes it can be really systemic, not just on an individual level, but ingrained within one's society. So in other words, a big problem. Well, that's it for this section, but stay tuned because there's more social psychology coming up soon.